History likes clean stories, clean villains, simple endings. Deadly truths exist because reality is messier than that. This is a show about power, how it's built, how it's protected, and how institutions decide who gets erased when the myth becomes inconvenient. Some of these stories are famous, some were buried on purpose, others were rewritten so often the truth barely survived. Here, we strip away the legend, we follow the records, we sit with the uncomfortable parts. Because the past is not dead, it's just been edited. This episode is based on historical records, court documents, reporting, and credible secondary sources. Interpretations are offered for analysis and discussion, not as legal conclusions, and listener discretion is always advised. Alcatraz is remembered as a prison that failed, as an island of escapes, riots, and Hollywood legends. That story is wrong. Alcatraz was not meant to rehabilitate. It was not meant to punish. It was meant to contain men the system could no longer control. And for years, that worked. Until one moment exposed what happened when containment collapses, when silence turns violent, and the system loses control inside its own walls. This is Deadbolts, a series about prisons within the Deadly Truths with Becca podcast. And this is about power and what societies do when locking someone away is the only solution left. This episode is the breaking point. Before we talk about gunfire, explosions, and Marines storming a prison, you have to understand one thing. Alcatraz was not supposed to have battles. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was designed as the opposite of a violent prison. The idea was to have no gangs, no riots, of course, no mass escapes, obviously, no inmate power structures at all. The federal government didn't send people to Alcatraz to fix them. It sent them there to remove them. If a prisoner kept causing trouble at other prisons, which happened all the time, organizing inmates, attacking guards, attempting escapes, or simply refusing to submit, Alcatraz was the final stop. You weren't sent there because you were the worst criminal. You were sent there because you were unmanageable, and that distinction matters. Alcatraz worked by cutting men off from everything that gave them leverage, and I discussed this on the very last episode that I did with Al Capone and Alcatraz. I did that episode because it is a quick and thorough way to show how Alcatraz can really cut the legs off of somebody like Al Capone, so to speak. Yes, he did have syphilis, but his deterioration accelerated because of Alcatraz. So it's a really good case study. If you have not looked into that episode or listened to that one prior to this one, I do recommend it, of course. So Alcatraz, there were no visitors without approval, no communication networks, no yard politics, which you have in pretty much every prison, right? There's no favors. Cells were small, routines were rigid, and silence was enforced. The prison relied less on physical brutality and more on predictability and, of course, isolation. Most inmates broke quietly, but the system had a weakness. Alcatraz assumed if you removed influence, you removed risk. What it underestimated was desperation. What happens when a man has nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go? By the mid-1940s, the population of Alcatraz included inmates who had already failed containment elsewhere. Men who had spent years bouncing between high-security facilities, stacking sentences, and accumulating resentment. Some were intelligent, some were just violent. All of them were trapped. Among them were Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, and Marvin Hubbard. 3 men who had become central to what happened next. They weren't masterminds chasing freedom. They were inmates who understood one brutal truth. Alcatraz was designed so you never left. And when a system gives people no exit, no hope for a transfer, no leverage, no future, The risk does not disappear, it concentrates. The Battle of Alcatraz was not a riot. It wasn't an escape story. It was a system stress testing itself and failing. And once it started, it couldn't be contained quietly anymore. This is the Battle of Alcatraz. It did not start with chaos. It started with observation. Inside Alcatraz, inmates lived on routines so rigid they could set a clock by them. Guards walked the same paths. Doors opened in the same order. Work details followed the same rhythms day after day. That predictability was the prison's strength, and it was also its blind spot. 3 inmates began quietly mapping it. The first was Bernard Coy. Coy was physically imposing, observant, and assigned to a work detail that gave him something most people on the Rock never had: proximity to guards and doors. He paid attention to keys, to how weapons were stored, to which doors lagged and which didn't. He learned how much force it took to bend a metal bar and how long it took before anyone noticed. The second was Joseph Kretzer. Kretzer was volatile, openly hostile to authority, and already serving a life sentence for murder. He wasn't planning for freedom, he was planning for leverage. That distinction matters. Men with nothing left to lose don't gamble for escape. They gamble for control. The third was Marvin Hubbard. Hubbard was not the driver of this plan, but he was the glue. Another inmate with time, resentment, and willingness to follow through once the line was crossed. This was not brilliance. It was time plus desperation. Over weeks, Coy secretly widened the ventilation opening behind his cell using a crude homemade spreader. Inch by inch, he created access to a utility corridor that guards didn't regularly inspect. The gap wasn't supposed to matter. Alcatraz wasn't built for escape routes. It was built on the assumption that no one would dare try. The assumption failed, like most of this story. On May 2nd, 1946, during a routine cellhouse work period, Coy made his move. He slipped through the widened vent, climbed into the corridor above the cell block, and positioned himself where guards would never expect an inmate to be. When Correctional Officer William Miller approached, Coy dropped down from behind, overpowering him. He did not knock him out. He didn't kill him. He took his keys. That moment, the instant the keys changed hands, was the real breach. Once Kretzer and Hubbard were released from their cells, the plan accelerated fast. The inmates armed themselves with weapons taken from the cellhouse armory, rifles that were supposed to be unreachable, stored behind bars the prison believed were absolute. They weren't. The men moved to take additional guards hostage, believing they could unlock the recreation yard door and reach the prison boat. This is where the system fought back, not with force, but with design. The yard door wouldn't open. The key they had did not fit. Alcatraz was not built with single points of failure. It was built with redundancy. And in that moment, the plan collapsed into something far more dangerous. Now, armed inmates were trapped inside a prison designed to prevent movement, holding hostages, firing shots, and realizing there was no clean way out. This was no longer an escape attempt, it was a siege inside a federal prison created by a system that believed containment made violence impossible. Once the yard door failed to open, the escape was over, whether the inmates accepted it or not. Inside the Rock, 3 armed inmates now found themselves trapped in a prison specifically engineered to stop that movement. They were holding rifles, they had grenades, and they had no exit. That combination is what turned a failed escape into a siege. The inmates dragged the 2 correctional officers into a cell and locked them inside. These weren't symbolic hostages, obviously, they were the leverage. The guards were beaten. They were injured and left bleeding in a space designed to hold inmates, not protect staff. Other guards were shot as the inmates tried to secure control of cell block D. Gunfire echoed through concrete corridors, smoke filled enclosed spaces. Inmates who had nothing to do with the escape were ordered back into their cells and locked in, listening to a prison unravel around them. From the outside, prison leadership was facing a nightmare scenario. The Rock had no type of protocol for armed inmates. It had no evacuation plan. It had no way to retake control without risking more deaths. This is a huge problem, everybody. Tear gas was attempted. It failed. Negotiation attempts stalled. The inmates were erratic. They were angry and already past the point of retreat. And then something unprecedented happened. Federal officials admitted that the Rock no longer was under their control. They requested military assistance. Within hours, the United States Marine Corps personnel crossed San Francisco Bay and took combat positions on Alcatraz Island. Active duty Marines aimed rifles and machine guns at the U.S. federal prison, something that had never happened before and has never happened since. This is the moment Alcatraz stopped being a prison problem and became a national security failure. Marines fired down onto the roof of Cellhouse D, attempting to force the inmates out through pressure and fear. Explosions followed when grenades detonated inside the cell house, blowing apart corridors, destroying doors, and igniting fires that no one could safely reach. The prison became a sealed concrete furnace. Inside, the inmates were losing control of their own situation. Ammunition ran low. And again, guys, not talking about a lot of people here, just talking about the 3 inmates. Smoke made breathing difficult. One of the men was fatally injured. The others were burned, disoriented, and physically collapsing. Meanwhile, and more importantly, the hostages, correctional officers William Miller and Harold Stites. They were dying. Stites succumbed to his injuries during that siege. Miller would die days later from wounds sustained during that takeover. They were not killed by criminals alone. They were killed by a system that had no backup plan once containment failed. After nearly 2 days, the siege ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. The surviving inmates, which was 2 guys, and then the Marines stood down. Fires were extinguished. Guards retook the cell house. What remained was wreckage. Cellhouse D was structurally destroyed. 2 guards were dead. And the most secure prison in America had required military force to regain control of itself. Alcatraz was supposed to be silent. It was supposed to be predictable. It was supposed to make violence unnecessary. Instead, it revealed the hard truth. When containment fails, it doesn't fail quietly, it fails catastrophically. And from that moment forward, Alcatraz was no longer a symbol of control. It was a warning. At this point, a lot of people are probably thinking the same thing. Hold on, this sounds like a riot, gunfire, hostages, explosions, Marines. So let's slow down and be very clear. This was not a riot. A riot is chaotic, it's emotional, it's spontaneous, it spreads like a virus. What happened at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was the opposite. Only 3 inmates were involved. Not dozens, not cell blocks full of men. The rest of the prison stayed locked down. There were no demands for better food, no protests, no ideology, no attempt to rally other inmates. This was not anger spilling over. It was a targeted takeover that failed. Here's the key difference most people miss. Riots are about expression. They're about control. The men involved did not try to burn the prison down. They tried to use it. They took keys. They took weapons. They took hostages. Those are not riot behaviors. Those are operational behaviors. And when the escape failed, the violence escalated not because they wanted chaos, but because the system left them no off-ramp. That's where people get tripped up. The violence didn't prove this was a riot. The violence proved this was a failed containment event. Think of it this way. A riot is a pressure valve blowing up. The The Battle of Alcatraz was a pressure cooker exploding. The prison was designed on a single assumption. If you isolate people hard enough, they stop being dangerous. What The Rock never planned for was what happens when isolation produces precision, not submission. When the yard door did not open, the plan did not dissolve into panic, it converted into leverage. That's not chaos, that's escalation. And once escalation starts inside a prison built to stop movement, the institution itself becomes the weapon. Concrete corridors, echoing sound, locked doors, no exits. So yes, it looks like a riot from the outside, but structurally, psychologically, and operationally, this was a siege inside a prison, not a riot inside a population. And that distinction matters because it explains why Alcatraz didn't have a bad day. It exposed a flaw in the entire theory behind it. Containment doesn't remove danger, it stores it. And when it leaks, it doesn't leak slowly, it detonates. Once the gunfire stopped, the story didn't end, it changed shape. When control was finally reestablished at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, there was no victory to announce, only damage to assess. Fires smoldered in Cellhouse D. Corridors were blown apart. 2 correctional officers were dead. Marines were packing up weapons that should never have been needed inside a prison. And the men at the center of it all were still alive, or at least 2 of them were. This is the part that gets skipped in most retellings because, well, it's not really all that exciting, is it? Bureaucratic, clinical. And that's where institutions protect themselves best, because nobody wants to listen to the boring parts. Investigations were launched, reports were written, responsibility was narrowed. The question shifted from what happened to how do we make sure this never happens again? Key point here, without admitting the system failed. The surviving inmates were isolated, interrogated, and processed through the mechanics that already knew its conclusion. Trials would follow, punishments would be final, and the public narrative would simplify the story into something safer to digest. But inside the system, something irreversible had occurred. Alcatraz had been exposed, not as weak, not as cruel, but as finite. The battle proved that even the most controlled environment has a breaking point, and once crossed, the cost is paid quietly by peoples whose names don't make the headlines. So now we move past the smoke and the gunfire. When the smoke cleared, the federal government faced a problem bigger than those 3 inmates. And none of that fit the story Alcatraz was supposed to tell. So the system did what systems always do after a public failure. It narrowed its responsibility. So you had Bernard Coy. He had been killed during that siege. His death simplified things. Dead men don't testify and they don't complicate the narrative. That left Joseph Kretzer and Marvin Hubbard. So let's clarify. They weren't questioned, they were processed. Their guilt was not in doubt, right? The only remaining question was how the government would respond without drawing attention to the deeper failure the battle had exposed. The trial was swift. Kretzer and Hubbard were charged with the murder of Correctional Officer Harold Stites. Officer William Miller had survived long enough to testify, but later did die from his injuries, reinforcing the severity of the case. There was no mystery for a jury to unravel. There was no appetite for nuance. Both men were convicted. Both were sentenced to death. In 1948, inside San Quentin State Prison, Joseph Kretzer and Marvin Hubbard were executed in the gas chamber. Their deaths closed the legal chapter. They did not close the institutional one. Inside the federal prison system, the Battle of Alcatraz triggered a quiet reassessment. Official reports emphasize procedural errors and individual misconduct, safer explanations than systematic flaws. Publicly, Alcatraz remained the prison that worked. Privately, the reputation had completely changed. Alcatraz required military intervention to maintain control. Clearly, this was a really big deal. That alone shattered its original purpose. The prison had been designed as a final solution, as I had discussed, a place so controlled that violence became unnecessary. But once the Marines were called in, the illusion of absolute containment completely collapsed. A prison that needed outside force to survive was no longer self-contained. Its real utility began to fade. By the early 1960s, federal officials were ready to admit what they wouldn't say out loud in 1946. The rock was not sustainable. In 1963, less than 2 days after the battle, the prison was officially closed, not because of escapes, not because of any riots, but because the system it represented had reached its limit. The Battle of Alcatraz didn't end the prison overnight. It started the countdown. It proved that containment without flexibility doesn't remove danger, it delays it. The cost is not paid by theories or blueprints, it's paid by people. And that's the truth Alcatraz could never fully lock away. So, hey, if you're still with me, I want to say something real quick. I get worked up about history. I always have. Love it. But what I love now is not myth, it's facts, truth, records, and what actually happened. I loved myths when I was a kid. Cowboys, outlaws, legends, heroes. I mean, hell, I even love the Loch Ness Monster. That's fine. That's childhood. This channel is not that. When I do an episode on people like Jesse James, Custer, Al Capone, or Alcatraz, I know some folks get uneasy when the mythology cracks. I see the comments. I always read them, don't worry. Some of you don't like it when the legend doesn't survive contact with reality. And I am sorry, but also, I'm not. There's a show I genuinely love and recommend. It's called Southern Fried True Crime. The host says it best. And basically, at the end of the day, that's the job, that's the point, telling the truth. If you're here just to get mad or type things like, send them all to Alcatraz, first of all, that ship sailed in 1963. Second, you're going to need a better comment than that. This is not your third grade history class. There are no gold stars for nostalgia, and nobody here is protecting myths for your comfort. If you are here for facts, context, and the uncomfortable truth, you're exactly where you should be. And if you're here for legends that never existed, there are plenty of channels for that. This just is not one of them. So, no gold stars for nostalgia.
Some say reopen Alcatraz. No, that idea is dumb as hell. And here's why. First, the cost alone makes it a non-starter. Alcatraz was outrageously expensive even in the 1930s. Every single thing had to be shipped in by boat, food, water, fuel, medical, supplies, staff. Today, with modern labor laws, union contracts, environmental regulations, and security requirements, it would be the most expensive prison per inmate on the planet, for no operational benefit. None. Second, it would be illegal on day one. Alcatraz was built on isolation, sensory deprivation, and long-term solitary confinement. That model collapses immediately under modern constitutional law. Courts now recognize that prolonged isolation causes serious psychological harm. You wouldn't even get past the first injunction. The lawsuits would start before the first inmate stepped on the boat. Third, the island is a liability, not a feature. Medical emergency? Delayed. Fire? Nightmare. Evacuation? Nearly impossible. Modern prisons are built with redundancy and access. Alcatraz is a single-point failure surrounded by cold water and bad weather. That's not security. That's negligence. Fourth, it solves nothing. Every function people think Alcatraz handled, containment, control, influence removal, already exists in modern supermax prisons, and they do it cheaper, safer, and under oversight. Reopening Alcatraz wouldn't fix crime. It would just look tough for people who confuse punishment theater with policy. Fifth, staffing it would be a disaster. Isolation, high stress, boat commutes, limited backup. Corrections already struggles with burnout and PTSD. Alcatraz would chew through staff faster than inmates. And finally, it exists in the worst possible political and legal context.
The Battle of Alcatraz is the moment everyone remembers because it was loud and, let's face it, even the name draws your attention, doesn't it? The Battle of Alcatraz. But it wasn't the most revealing thing that happened on that island. The real story comes after the smoke clears and when the prison goes back to being quiet. And we look at what Alcatraz did to people without a siege, without the Marines, without headlines. Because most men did not explode at Alcatraz, they disappeared inside of it. The next episode, we're shifting from institutional collapse to psychological erosion. And we're following one man the system didn't need to fight. It just waited. If the Battle of Alcatraz showed you what happens when containment fails loudly, Henry Young shows you what happens when it succeeds. And that might be harder to listen to. Before we close this out, I want to say thank you, genuinely, to the people who stick with these stories all the way through, who listen instead of react, who care about facts over comfort. You're the reason this show exists. You get the gold star, not for agreeing with me, but for staying curious. I know these stories are not always easy, and I know they are not always nostalgic. There's only been a few that I've done the research on, and they can still stand the test. But you stay anyway, and that matters more than the clicks. If these episodes make you think, challenge something you thought you knew, or made you see a familiar story differently, take a second to follow, to rate, or subscribe. It helps this channel reach the people who actually want this kind of work. You can find more episodes like this under Deadbolts and across the channel. There is The Mob is Dead, Hollywood is Dead, Dead City, Dead State, The Frontier is Dead. They're all under Deadly Truce by Becca, all built on the same promise. There's no myth, maybe a tad nostalgia, but then sadly, when we dig into it, it usually takes away what nostalgia we had. There's just truth. And if you're new here, welcome. And if you've been here a while, thank you for trusting me with your time. I'm Becca. This is Deadly Truth, because the past is not dead. It's just been managed.